Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you today. Thanks for being here. I know you're anxious to hear Paul talk about some of his stuff. I do want to talk a little bit about the other parts of the program first, however. So on Sunday, it's our annual holiday concert we're calling Winterscapes, and we have, I believe, 7 pieces on the program. So we're starting with a Christmas festival, Leroy Anderson, and ending with Sleigh Ride, which means that we're having a Leroy Anderson sandwich or something, but the opposite of that. It's an other stuff sandwich on Leroy Anderson, I guess you would call it. And then on the rest of the first half of the program, we'll do a piece called 3 Wassail Dances by Philip Lane. If we have time to talk about that, I will, but I mostly want to save my little wassailing lecture for the concert, so I'll talk a lot about that one then. The main piece I'll talk about today is Christus Part 1 by Mendelssohn. We'll talk about how that relates to the holiday concert and things like that in just a bit. We're also doing a really fun piece called Slalom, which is by an American composer named Carter Pan, lives in Colorado, and basically it's inspired by what seems to me to be a very dangerous occupation of skiing down a slope while having headphones on, listening to music. But basically the entire piece is a very eventful trip from the top of a mountain to the bottom one, and I think everybody's going to really like that one except for the violin section. And then on the second half, we'll have the premiere of Grace, which is Paul and my collaboration in celebration of the 60th anniversary of the Symphonic Choir. And again, we'll talk about that one a lot. And of course, we'll have our sing-along as well, so enthusiastic participation is, of course, expected for that. But let's talk Mendelssohn. In the first half of the 19th century, Europe is going through a whole lot of soul searching. It seems like Europe is going through a lot of soul searching every 10 minutes or so, but this is a particularly sort of interesting time. It's post-American and French revolutions, and those kind of come from this sort of optimism, right? We're going to create this new world order where the kings and the priests aren't going to tell us what to do. We're going to base all of our decisions on our reason and our intellect and these kind of universal ideas of how all humanity can live together in a certain way. It doesn't turn out quite that way. People get kind of disillusioned about it with the Napoleonic Wars and things like that. And by the time we get to Congress of Vienna, 1814, 1815, there's a lot of sort of confusion about what to do. You have the monarchs who are sort of cracking down on these kind of democratic reforms on the one hand, but a lot of these ideas are still around and things like that. You have a lot of censorship, and nobody is quite sure politically where things are going to go. Instead of universalism, you have some people who are sort of re-espousing the virtues of nationalism, that these different country characters are really important and we should embrace them rather than try to kind of unite them. And if you want to think in very broad terms, it's this classical notion of order and things like that is kind of yielding, or at least being competed with by these very romantic notions of what is in your heart and being very true to yourself, and very emotional. There's a lot of things like sort of superstition is making a comeback, right? Enlightenment thinking is very anti-superstitious. But some people are more into these sort of fantasy worlds and things like that, magic and mesmerism and things like that. These less kind of purely rational ideas are starting to kind of come back in a way that sort of competes with these Enlightenment ideas. So yeah, it's a sort of confusing time politically and philosophically. It's also a very confusing time musically. And it seems to all evidence that it's just, a lot of it is because of Beethoven. Some of it is because of the social changes that are happening. But Beethoven just casts such a long shadow. Everybody thinks he's the greatest genius of all time, and it's really intimidating. And so suddenly a lot of people who have a lot of things that are sort of taken for granted musically, stylistically, are suddenly no longer, they're no longer able to do so. I often compare Beethoven to music's original sin, in the sense that everybody becomes kind of self-aware all of a sudden, and they have to make decisions that they never had to make before. So if you're a composer living in the age after Beethoven, what do? You have basically two choices. One is to sort of move as hard as you can away from Beethoven, even if philosophically you're saying, oh, this is what Beethoven did too. You're doing things, you're sort of not trying to compete with Beethoven in his own realm. So you do things like write lots of operas, for instance. Beethoven wrote a grand total of one opera called Fidelio, and it wasn't especially successful. He re-edited it 1,000,000 times and things like that. So it was someplace where you didn't have quite as long a shadow over you in that case. You could also go kind of the opposite direction, write these really kind of small character pieces, miniature piano pieces. That's something that someone like Chopin did, who wrote tons of these 4 or 5 minute long dances. Or you could write art songs. Basically, mostly these are songs for single voice and piano. So Schubert, for instance, wrote about 600 of those. And again, it's because Beethoven wrote a few of those, but he didn't sort of dominate the field in the same way. And so you can explore those ideas in that way as well. And they also correspond really well to these romantic ideas of sort of these very personal modes of expression. These art songs really allow you to do that well. So you can go that direction, or you can go the absolute other direction and you say, you know what, these people like Beethoven and Bach and Mozart and Haydn, they're all amazing, so what we need to do is figure out what they did and do the same thing. Maybe adding a little bit of a contemporary twist to it, but this worked, and we are going to take what they did and make it work for us as well. And that's basically the approach that Mendelssohn took. Mendelssohn is, in many ways, one of the most conservative composers of his day in that regard, although he also is one of the ones who created the sort of modern classical music world, which I think is very important. So, who's Mendelssohn? Mendelssohn was born in 1809 and he died in 1847. Let's see, he grew up in Berlin, fantastically rich, freakishly rich. One of his childhood homes would end up becoming the Parliament building, one of the Parliament buildings for one of the German parliaments. Yeah, it's the Prussian one. I think it's the equivalent of like the House of Lords in the 19th century, that kind of thing. So a big building, that. He comes from a long line of sort of important Jewish figures. His grandfather, Moses Mendelssohn, was one of the leading Jewish philosophers of his day, one of the first Zionists. His father, Abraham, is a huge banker in Berlin. That's how they get all of their money. But Mendelssohn himself, not Jewish. Abraham decided to raise his children as what we would call Lutherans. And so Mendelssohn has this sort of conflicted identity with this very strong Jewish heritage, but he himself, his faith was Lutheran for his entire life. He also represents sort of an interesting trend in that, so as a very rich young man, he could travel and meet anyone in the world. And if they were famous during that time, he met them. All the great thinkers, Goethe and everybody around Goethe, people like that. And routinely took trips to Italy and especially to England, where he became a really prominent figure, met the Queen, met the Prince, knew Prince Albert very well, and learned to speak English very well. If you read Mendelssohn's English writing, it's very good. And he ends up being sort of part of this tradition that the English have. There's sort of this running joke that the English couldn't produce a homegrown decent musician to save their lives for about 200 years, from about Henry Purcell to Edward Elgar. And so what they did is they imported their great music. And the most famous of these is Handel, who came to London to write all of these, a bunch of operas, a bunch of oratorios, all this, these big choral orchestral works intended for public consumption. England has a very strong, what we would call public, which is basically a fancy word for people who will buy tickets to stuff. And so if you are a kind of, if you're a hardcore capitalist, you can make a lot of money off this. You find these great musicians, you bring them into town, and then you produce these concerts. So Handel is the first big name to do that. The next one to come in is Haydn, who spent most of his life in Hungary, working at a court there for a nobleman. But once his duties there sort of died down, they snap him up and they bring him to London, where he makes a huge amount of money writing symphonies again for the London public. And Mendelssohn is sort of the third person to come along in this chain. He doesn't quite settle there the way that someone like Handel does. Mendelssohn would spend his whole life going sort of back and forth between London and his home in Leipzig, where he had a permanent position with the orchestra there. But he had a hugely sort of successful career as an English composer as well as a German one. And if you are someone in that position, you are essentially expected to do kind of what Handel did, right? So a lot of Mendelssohn's music is modeled off of that Handel oratorio tradition. So his most famous piece, his sort of great work, is Elijah, this 2.5-hour awesome oratorio about the life and death and flying up in a whirlwind of the Old Testament prophet Elijah. But it wasn't the only one he wrote. He wrote one about St. Paul, and he was working on one when he died that would eventually be called Christus, although that wasn't the name he gave it. They're basically these sort of fragments of stuff that he was going to put into something, and it turns out that the fragments that survived, one happened to be the tale of the three wise men, and the other was part of the Passion. And so when people were compiling these together, they called it Christus. It seemed to be all Jesus related, so it seemed like a reasonable thing to do. But he never called it that, and his vision for it is a little bit vague, but it seems like it actually probably wasn't quite just simply a life of Jesus kind of thing. In any case, what we end up with are these two parts. Christus Part 1, which is just a short telling of the Magi, and Christus Part 2, which has to do with the Passion. So that's a long way of getting us to, we're going to be performing Christus Part 1 on Sunday. And again, this is something that is very much modeled and inspired by Handel and things like the Messiah. So I'm going to play you a little bit of Messiah. You may recognize it. Very short. That's it. It's one of the famous alto recitatives that they have. And when you're doing these recits, it's just sort of storytelling stuff. And that is, so what they say, behold, the virgin shall conceive, and his name shall be Emmanuel, God with us. Now let's listen to the opening of Christus Part 1. Especially that opening is very similar, right? Behold, a virgin shall conceive, and then the second one is when Jesus our Lord. It's almost the exact same melody that he's using. A very clear kind of connection between those two pieces. And of course, the subject matter is very much connected too, right? They're both about the birth of Jesus. In this case, we're not talking about what they're going to call him. They're talking about when that happens, how the three wise men appear. So next we're going to get the rest of the story. And so the basic form of these little kind of self-contained units in these oratorios is to tell us what happens and then give a kind of theological interpretation of what happens. So we have the recit, which introduces us, and now we're going to have the three wise men tell us what they're talking about, tell us what they're doing. And in this case, for very obvious reasons, Mendelssohn sets the three wise men as a male trio. We'll be doing it with the full male chorus, which is a pretty common way to do it. It's what they do on this recording as well, but it's for three male parts. And they say, where is he, born the King of Judea? For we have seen his star and have come to adore him. before we continue, I'll point out a couple of things. First of all, we know this is walking music because you can hear the bass line going. Well, that's the sort of traveling thing, that's sort of the undercurrent for it. Also, the orchestration is interesting too. It's only low strings. It's only viola, cello, and bass. And in that sense, it's keeping all of the instrumental registers in the same register as the men who are singing. So that's the story. We now know what's going on, right? There's a star, the wise men have followed it and are looking for this king so that they can adore this king. And now we get our kind of theological sort of, not exegesis exactly, but this kind of context added. And the text that Mendelssohn uses for this context adding is, there shall a star from Jacob come forth, and a scepter from Israel rise up. And that text comes from Numbers. It comes from a story, so the Israelites have just come back out of Egypt, and they're wreaking havoc in what we call the Holy Land. And one of the kings is really upset. And this king of Moab named, what's his name, Balak, I guess, is... he asks a prophet named Balaam to curse the Israelite people, and Balaam won't do it because God is telling him what to say, and God says that you should bless the people of Israel, not curse them. And at one point he says basically that Moab, you're in tough shape because there will be a king that comes forth and they will destroy your kingdom. And that's the star from Jacob with the scepter is this thing that's going to destroy your kingdom and build this other one. And that's a very kind of historic look at that text, but it's also often used as a sort of messianic text, right? Not just referring to somebody like King David, who would come along later, but also to Jesus as doing this sort of the spiritual realm as well. So the way you hear this in Mendelssohn's setting is, first of all, you get some very starry music because the strings are in this kind of shimmery passage the entire time. And, well, let's start with there. That's the good news. The bad news, of course, is that the entire world order is going to be destroyed. And so now all of that calm music is going to yield to some not really angry music, but slightly more emphatic, less pure joyful music. So the star shall come forth, the scepter shall rise up, and now we are going to dash in pieces, princes of nations. Timpani is helping us with our revolution. Sort of clearly defined where we fit into kind of our musical and theological world. We're going to end with a chorale, and this chorale is an existing chorale. This is one that's written in the 1500s, How Brightly Beams the Morning Star. Again, more star imagery. And this is something that would happen all the time, again, within the sort of Lutheran music tradition. These something that Mendelssohn is asserting his identity in that way. Bach did it all the time. Mendelssohn grew up having to study Bach. His private music teacher, again, very rich when he was very young, had him study Bach's music all the time. And so this kind of chorale ending very much falls into the Bach Lutheran tradition. You may not know this, but the religious instrument, do you know what the religious instrument is? The trombone. It's absolutely true. The trombone is the instrument that you use to double like choral parts. And again, the trombones hardly ever play in this piece. They only come in once the chorale part starts. And that is, again, it's a very strong symbol that this is religious music. Our trombones have come in now we're in church, basically. Yes. Shame how you can't quite understand the words, but our choir is going to do a much better job of that, right? Cool. Well, Paul, do you want to come up? Welcome.
I would have said the harp, a religious instrument, the harp, the trombone, I don't know.
Yeah, the harp, the organ, those are the guesses most people make. But yeah, and if you look at like Renaissance era paintings and the cherubs and things flying around, there's usually a few trombone players up there. So,
That's right, yeah.
but it's considered a very vocal instrument, so that's why they're always doubling the choir parts in 17th, 18th century religious texts. And you can tell it's such an obvious symbol when a composer uses the trombone that they're invoking that kind of religiosity. In Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the Zeitumschlungen Millionen music, that's the first time not the first time, but it's one of the times where we talk about divinity a lot, and all of those parts are doubled by trombone. So yeah, a very kind of obvious semiotic clue to what's going on. Yeah?
Since you're focusing on trombone for a moment, what about the even in the text of the Brahms work it talks about trombone?
The Posaune, yeah.
Yes.
That's a little bit tricky because that text refers to
The time of the last trumpet.
yeah, the time of the last trumpet, right? And these instruments sort of 2,000 years or earlier didn't exist, right? So they're basically having to guess at what the closest translation is. Yeah, I mean, certainly the last trumpet, as John of Revelation fame thought of it, didn't have a slide, but it also didn't have valves. So it's basically a horn, a kind of bugle-ish kind of thing. So you can sort of pick your most convenient modern translation and run with it, basically, in that case. Yeah. Well, just a little bit of history of this project here. As I said, it's the 60th anniversary of our symphonic choir, and one of the things the symphony has done over the years for these anniversaries is commission new pieces. And so we did a new orchestra piece last year for the anniversary of the orchestra, and I felt like it was something we wanted to do to bring a new piece into the world for the symphonic choir as well. I also knew that I wanted to do it for our holiday concert, which is a little bit unusual. You don't usually do commissions and new works on holiday concerts. But the symphonic choir has been part of the holiday concert since basically the beginning. I think the first program I have for holiday symphonic choir stuff is from 1961, that Christmas concert. So it's always been part of that tradition. And so celebrating the choir on that concert seemed to make a lot of sense. And we talked a little bit about maybe finding a composer and things like that, but it seemed like kind of a cool idea to actually commission the text itself rather than the music. And so I was looking for people that might have a local significance for our community. And I was given a book of Paul's poems, and I thought they were really wonderful. And so I asked him to help us out with this project, and he was gracious enough to say yes. And so thank you, Paul, and again, welcome. It's good to have you here.
I think it was more along the lines of a maybe. I distinctly remember that I didn't want to go toward that word commission because it was more of an obligation to nail it. And I said, let's forget about commission. Let me take a run at this. I'm in it for the journey. It will be a brand new journey for me. And I'll get it to you as early as you want. And then you have the rights of first veto. So I think that's a kind of I was operating in the blind. I had no idea. I was counting on channeling from the musical universe through the whole process.
Well, Paul, can you give us, I know, I'm sure some of these people know you reasonably well, but could you give us a 2-minute biography?
I grew up in an iron ore mining town. My father worked a mile underground in the hematite mines, a lot like Butte, very tough logging, mining, 60 bars on the main street kind of town. I grew up in a bookless house and lived a very visceral childhood, learned how to work real hard. That was the greatest gift my parents gave me. My mother told me later on in life that she came from the old country, Italy. In utero, was processed at Ellis Island, loved coffee, and she said when she was cradling me as an infant, I would reach for her coffee cup, and she put a few drops in my baby bottle, and I had no choice but to become a poet. But I think of myself as a visceral poet, a blue-collar poet. I rode bucking horses for 12 or 15 years, bareback horses, and just dumb luck at the same time that I was trying to give up the arena. Cowboy poetry, the phenomenon of cowboy poetry surfaced, and I was embraced and given a way to make a living on stage, and for which I will be forever grateful. And here I am, I guess, the one and only Polish mafioso rodeo poet.
I'm sure there'll be many later, but
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about how this project was, you were a little bit unsure of it at first. Why was that?
I don't know anything about what you do. I don't know anything about your genre of music. Nothing. And I had stood before 3 symphonies and performed my work with a symphony accompaniment. And so that gave me a little glimpse of what happens. And I had written a lot of lyrics for mostly cowboy singer-songwriters, Wiley Gustafson and Ian Tyson and Cowboy Celtic. And so I knew a little bit about the format of writing for a vocal presentation. But that was about all I had to go on. And so I needed something, and you were gracious enough to have read enough of that book to discover that little tiny poem called Grace, which I had written for the Millennial Cowboy Poetry, National Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Elko, Nevada. I'm going again in January for the 34th consecutive year. I had written a 10-line verse for their Millennial poster in celebration, I think, in large part of landscape. No wide open spaces, no wild landscape upon which to run cattle, no need for the horse, no need for the horse, no need for the cowboy. That's the hierarchy. It all starts with Mother Earth. It all starts with open country, the landscape. And when you said that you were appreciative of that, but it was too short, I thought that little piece has been begging me for decades to grow into something bigger. And so I ran with that, thanks to you.
Well, yeah, and I think, reading a lot of your poetry, what I'm struck by is that a lot of it is very kind of personal and intimate, and lots of little details about, your socks and things like that. And I remember when we first talked about the project, I think my main comment was, I really like this stuff you write. It's going to be sung by 90 people, right? And come off a little strange if 90 people are singing about their socks. So I think what struck me about Grace is not only was it beautiful, but it also seemed to be the poem that had the most potential for kind of a universality to it, one that could be sung as a community. And I think that's why it seemed to be a good place to start anyway, for that one.
But did you have confidence that I was going to be able to do this? Because I was very uncertain.
Of course
when
I did.
Said to the early drafts, I was braced. I had steeled myself for hearing Paul. This is very good, but I can't get people to sing. I can't play music. I was expected to hear it.
Well, I'm just thinking about our sort of back and forth during those first couple of months.
It really was a collaboration. That's
Most of them, I think most of my comments were actually about use of musical terms, right? And like which musical words we wanted to use and things like that. Like I mentioned, there's a reference in there. A lot of your poetry uses musical words and refers to musicians and things like that. Like one of them I mentioned, I talked about Chopin earlier. Chopin was in that first draft, I think, and I sort of pointed out that virtually everything Chopin wrote is for solo piano. And if this is a choral and orchestral work, maybe we should go in a different direction in that regard about our sort of musical references.
Chopin was Polish, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so you can't blame me for thinking.
Sure. Had it been, Moniuszko or Paderewski or Penderecki or something like that, maybe we could have gone that. But yeah, it was a lot of that kind of stuff, and talking about certain words, that, if I'm going to ask a bunch of musicians to sing these words, they're going to have a different connotation than someone who isn't sort of in that world all the time. I think one of them was, you'd use the phrase bel canto, which in its basic Italian just means beautiful singing, right? But bel canto in the classical music world is actually a very specific opera style from the early 1800s. And so it has a sort of added level of meaning for the musical stuff. And I think I just wanted to make sure that those additional layers of meaning would work and made sense, as well as the sort of standard of those.
And I don't think you knew, maybe you did, that I studied with a great American poet at the University of Montana, Richard Hugo. And he would say things in the workshops like, in all poems, there's a constant battle going on between the music and the message. In the very best poems, neither ever wins. And I was fascinated, in my humble opinion, of all the art forms, okay, music arguably is paramount, leads the charge in moving us closer to what it means to be human. I really believe that. And so I've loved music my entire life, knew nothing about it, but when Richard Hugo gave me the opportunity to make music out of the sounds of words in the poem, I embraced it. I thought, this is, I can look in the mirror and see Mick Jagger. I embraced it. And so a lot of the words that I completely lose track oftentimes of the meaning, the message, and I'm using words just for the ring and the ricochet they are affecting off of other words. I'll use words that I don't even know the meaning of, or I'll look it up and forget it. I don't care about the meaning. I just want the notes. Yeah, and so thank you for your...
Yeah, well, we talked a little bit about that. Occasionally I would send back sort of a comment like, I'm not sure what this means, and Paul would say, yeah, that's okay.
I don't know either.
But they create sort of beautiful images. And one of the ones that we've talked about in the choir rehearsals is colorful hover. I have no idea what a colorful hover is, but it's a really glorious notion in some sense, and it's one that I enjoy singing and hearing and things like that. And so there's a few moments like that.
Right.
And it sort of turns your brain in an interesting direction, trying to sort of, it reminds me a little bit of, an American Pie. There's that line about a bronchic buck.
Yeah.
And nobody realizes that that's a Spoonerism, right?
Yeah.
It's a bucking bronc.
Yeah.
But somehow it still works, kind of, even though theoretically it shouldn't make any sense, but it still somehow is successful. And it's just it's sort of a cool notion. So, did you find, were you hitting writer's block and things like that?
No, I don't believe it. I turned, you put the first words on the page, and I already had that first little 10-liner that I used pretty much for the first verse, and it just takes over. You have to relinquish control. You can't be a control freak and kind of throw the reins out over the horse's head and let it go where it wants to go, and hope it takes you someplace Star Trekian boldly where no man or woman has. That's what I'm in it for. My mantra is create sans destination. I don't want to know where I'm being taken. Just take me somewhere I've never been before. And every morning I worked on that piece for 3 months, almost daily. And every morning something I would be led in a different direction. And even if it was a dead end, it was just such a joy to have gotten that. So, it was hard to let go of after 3 months. On a personal note, I emailed you on April 25th, and we had lost our beloved dog, Zeke. And he's in the picture of the two of us that you see. And I thought, there's no way, this has been such an endeavor of joy. There's no way I should come back and revise a word, change a word in the midst of the sorrow that I was. So I let it go that very morning. I said, this is it. And because it was an endeavor of joy. It was a joyride. And I heard Adam Cohen, Leonard Cohen's son, recently interviewed by Terry Gross, and he talked about his father working 12 years on Hallelujah and 84 verses. And he said that his father believed that the last thought is the best thought. And I stood up and I just leapt for joy because I've always believed that. Not the first thought, but the last thought is the best. Just stick with it. I would have loved to have stuck with this piece for another 11 years and 9 months. Gone with it. So to answer your question, no, I could keep coming back to it, and it would keep taking me in fresh directions and teaching me. In the midst of it all, I learned more. I had heard a story years and years ago about the woman, is it Carolyn Unger, the contralto, who was there at the premiere of Beethoven's Ninth, and he finished and he had his back to the audience and he couldn't hear, and it took a woman's sensibility to step out from that choir, not a man, a woman, and turn him toward the audience so he could experience the praise. And I couldn't get that out of my head. And so I think it influenced subliminally that the piece became more and more a celebration of women, and vicariously through the celebration of one of the grandest doms of all, Mother Earth. It's a celebration of Mother Earth and of women in general. And I took a shot at that in 2 couplets. At one point, can we be really honest here? At one point, I emailed Grant and I said, I'm trying to understand Beethoven's Ninth and how he turned this Friedrich Schiller poem into something so magnificent, because it's really pretty much an average poem, and you agree.
Well, anybody who, scholarly people about that poem will say, this is not a great poem,
No.
but it somehow turns into this great monument of the classical music.
So that kind of gave me an out. I thought, I can write a not-so-great poem, and Grant Harville will be my Ludwig van Beethoven. Yeah.
I just got done talking about that long shadow issue. You know, footsteps of giants, that's what Brahms always said. Yeah, nobody needs that. Well, you know, we can talk a little bit about what's actually in the poem and things like that. The passage, there's a very explicit passage about womankind shine into Beethoven's Ninth, and that's the one of the ones that we talked about, because Beethoven and femininity actually has a very sort of fraught history.
Right, understood.
Yeah, Beethoven himself spent about half a decade or so really being miserable to his sister-in-law, Johanna, and that part of his legacy is very. Beethoven was a jerk. I mean, we have to understand that he was not always a very nice person. And he could be very generous sometimes, but he was also always sick all the time, so he was sort of always in a bad mood. But he wasn't always really good to the people around him, especially Johanna and especially his nephew Karl. But going even beyond that, there are some music theorists who actually hear violence against women in the actual notes that he wrote, including Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And so I thought we should be very careful about how we, explore this idea of femininity and Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And I think we got to a good place. And I think there is actually a reference at the end of the poem, near the end of the poem, to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And of course, as a composer, that's an interesting thing, because this piece has so much musical imagery in it. How do you incorporate that into it without turning it into sort of mime or something like that? You don't want to be too sort of on the nose with this stuff. You want to kind of, it'll draw people out of the music and into the reference if the reference is too obvious, And so, actually, at that moment when they're singing about Beethoven's Ninth, I will use the piano after the poem.
All right.
So everybody's favorite Beethoven's Ninth tune is this one, right? And I felt if we had been singing "Womankind shined into Beethoven's Ninth" or something like that, it would seem a little stilted. So basically, as part of the accompaniment, if you know the opening, the main melody of the third movement is this. Sorry, I'll do it here. And so I decided that those first four notes would be really good. And so during the entire time that this passage is going on, the horns do this. They start here, actually, a step higher. Which also sounds sort of Christmassy. I felt good about that. Before finally dropping down to Beethoven's notes. Before eventually kind of
I love it.
Yeah, when you can steal, it makes things so much easier.
But you didn't know that that's what I was subliminally channeling until after you had written the music, Carolyn Unger turning.
Yeah. I don't remember the exact timeline of that, but yeah.
Would that have changed the way you were, with that image in your head? Would that have changed? Yeah.
Hard to say. It's hard to say how things would have gone in other circumstances.
But Womankind did shine when she turned him toward the audience.
Right,
you know?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, that moment in the poem, again, is sort of near-ish the end. There's a kind of coda after that. Again, it needed to have something with Beethoven's Ninth Minute, or else it just wouldn't make any sense. But it also, that word shine is in there. It's very shiny music.
Shine, night, shine.
Yeah, well, in that assonance, there's tons of assonance in that part. Shine, ninth, flight.
Joy, I think.
Yeah, lots of that I sound.
Yeah.
And which is a very bright vowel, which is an inherently kind of shiny vowel all by itself. And so at that moment, I don't know if we have sopranos. What they're doing is they're shouting at the top of their lungs on that word flight, but singing that high I sound. So again, it's very shiny. The chimes are playing, lots of the sort of bright percussion instruments are playing as well. And then what was sort of nice about that is that chord, in music theory land, they call that a major seventh chord or a major seventh chord. That became kind of the dominant sound for most of the piece. So the first chord that the choir sings is this, which is just a transposition of those same four notes. Which again is just move it a little bit down the piano and you get the exact same thing. And the entire section in the Sunlight's Rays section of the poem, every chord that the choir sings there is either this, or this, or this, like that. It's that sonority which kind of turns into a dominating feature, especially for the outer sections of the piece. And it's just those four notes of Beethoven's Ninth, sort of all jammed into one place.
So is the music that the casual audience member, the music that person will respond to most familiarly, is that Home on the Range?
Yeah, well, we haven't actually talked much about the overall structure of the poem, right? So the poem, you can clarify.
It'll give me a home where the poetry roams.
Right. Yeah, so it's basically in three sections, it's sort of verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus.
With a bridge.
With a bridge.
Yeah, in celebration of the first peoples, the Native Americans.
Right. One of the first things I told Paul was this is part of our holiday concert. It'll be in December, so we want it to be wintry. And so for the bridge, Paul has different references to these
wintry moons.
Wintry December moon, so the moon of the popping trees, and the moon when the deer shed their horns, that sort of thing. Those are all Native American words for December, basically. And but yeah, so the chorus each time, we get verse, chorus, bridge, verse, chorus, coda, basically. The words play on Home on the Range. You'll give us a home where the poetry roams, that kind of thing. And so that was another thing where if I had set those words to the tune, it would have felt silly, I think. But instead, I decided to make that melody the kind of framing device of the whole piece. So the opening essentially goes like this. There's creepy, weird stuff happening up here. Sorry, it's even higher than that. Played by a solo violinist. And so if you're wondering when the piece is over, it's when you hear that melody again at the end. But yeah, and then sort of within that, again, there's these sort of three, in my mind anyway, I sort of turned it into kind of three basic chunks in the middle. And basically it goes really peaceful and I hope pretty. And the third part is also peaceful and pretty. The middle part is not peaceful and pretty. The middle part is the sort of dominant image for me, inspiring image was a pack of wolves running through the moonlight through the snow, which is one of the events of that. So there's howling, in a manner of speaking, anyway, not literally, I hope, but these wolf howl hallelujahs, which are in the poem, are set as this hallelujah, hallelujah. Hard notes to learn, as our chorus will attest, but they're doing a great job with it. And there is this sort of sense, even one of the images is pines who prowl, and that's these sort of low, sort of heavy chords. But basically that one is the most kind of frantic and driving and chaotic section, which again, sort of the middle section in between these two kind of prettier, more peaceful.
All informed when I was thinking about Grant's cue, winter. I thought, when I think of winter, I grew up in Wisconsin. I moved to Missoula. I thought I had moved to Miami Beach. You don't have any idea what winter is. And when I thought of winter, what's a quintessential, the definitive visual image? Well, many of them from my childhood, but more familiar. And I thought of that scene in Dr. Zhivago, where they go to the ice palace and they go into that old palace and everything is covered in ice, and the wolves are howling. I believe they are howling in that scene or in the middle of the night. But isn't there a scene where Omar Sharif, he hasn't written poetry for a long time, and he gets up and help me with this in the middle of the night, and there's a big desk, a big oak desk, mahogany desk, and there's only one little piece of paper and a pencil. I still work in notebooks with pencil. And young Omar Sharif, his eyes, that moonlight coming through the frosted windows and into his eyes as the poetry starts coming back, and he starts putting those first words on the page. Wow, that's winter.
Well, while we have Paul here, do you have questions? Yeah.
I do. As a very non-creative person, I've been curious. I remember Elton John said, is it Ira Turpin who writes the lyrics for Elton John? Anyway, his lyrics.
Bernie Taupin. Bernie Taupin. Yeah.
Okay. I was close.
Yes, you were. And I'm so happy you brought him up, because if I could have been anybody else in life, it would have been him. All he has to do is write this beautiful stuff, doesn't have to go on stage.
No.
Has a big ranch in Colorado. He goes to his mailbox and gets $1 million checks.
He does have to pick
Anyway,
him up.
I interrupted you. I'm
He
sorry.
does have to pick him up out of the gutter once in a while. But anyway, he writes the lyrics, and then Elton John writes the music
Yes.
to accompany it. Is that a normal kind of situation? I would have thought it would be the music was written first, and then the lyricist. How did Ira and Jordan write, Gershwin? How did they do it?
Yeah, words first, generally speaking. I think-
yes.
Yeah, although the composer will often sort of tweak things if they find a rhythm they like or something like that. But yeah, it's almost always words first. Just for me as a composer, it's just so much more inspiring to have something to base something on. And the hardest part about being a composer is not that you don't have any ideas, it's that you have 7 billion ideas. You have 1 million places you could start. And so the first thing you need to do is get rid of 999,000 of them, right? And so when you have a poem to start you off, that sort of focuses your energy in a good direction. So I would certainly, if I'm going to write a vocal piece, I really want the text first. So that might put more of a burden on the
I love you for that. You have no idea how many singer-songwriters that I have pitched lyrics to, and very rudely tell me that's not how it works. That organically the music and the words come together when they're writing a song. And I think in an interview, Sting, the musician and singer-songwriter, Sting said something derogatory to the point that people often send him lyrics and he doesn't know what he's supposed to do with them. It's like looking at a one-legged man. That's right. And so I have had a half a dozen musicians like Grant who are happy to have the words before them, before they start working on a melody. And I'm so grateful for that.
Yeah, I think I freely admit I am no lyricist, and I think, if I were like a singer-songwriter type, it would probably be what you're talking about, where it sort of all comes out as one thing. But, for most classical composers, they're taking existing texts, even if it's not written for them. So, I mentioned Schubert writing all those songs. Those poems already existed, right? There's a bunch of Goethe and Schiller and things like that. And so he's taking poems he likes and setting them to music. Certainly in the classical music realm, that's by far the most common way to do that. Other stuff? Yeah.
I'm just excited for Sunday and coming to the concert, but I'm just wondering if Paul wouldn't mind sharing with us just the seed in which this whole project has grown from. Meaning him to recite the 8 to 10 lines or whatever of grace. Is that possible?
The little poem, let's see, the original poem.
Yeah.
In the soft low light up high, where love has always thrived and will forever yearn for the colorful hover. In the soft low light up high, where love has always thrived and will forever yearn for the colorful hover, a brush stroke of words out of the west, we still want free life, we still want fresh air. And as millenniums meander by like birthdays to the earth, what thrill a saffron blade of grass, blue sage, scrub oak still brings us on our daily jaunt across the land, our daily poem, our prayer. I never had trouble delivering colorful hover until you brought it up. Thanks a lot, man.
Well, and with just a few small adjustments, that's the opening of the piece.
Yeah, I think I rewrote one line to make it more Montana. Blue sage, scrub oak, Montana wild with a four-legged folk. I think I changed that line. It is a celebration of the planet Earth. I'm very concerned. I told Grant, I warned him that I can't disconnect sociopolitically from the page. These are very, very toxic, ugly, alarming, frightening times. And so I think climate change, was the little cloud over on the side, and I wanted to celebrate how fortunate we are to have this incredible hole on which to breathe air and drink water and love one another. And so, I don't know how I got off on that. I'm sorry.
Well, thank you, Paul. Glad to have you here, and looking forward to Sunday.